people. President Biden talks about it all the time. Vice President Harris has talked about it. But and you can see that in the 200 million people vaccinated, the 6.9 million jobs created.
Not really. You don't see the election fraud even come up in a lot here. Democrats basically agree on one reason why they think the democracy is under threat. It is Donald Trump. But this is, Peter Baker, pretty concerning overall. The rationales may not matter if everybody agrees that our democracy is crumbling.
We're at a moment in our society I don't think a lot of us ever expected to be, right? Where we're questioning the very foundations of things that we took for granted for decades, for generations. I don't think we ever sort of thought, growing up, I didn't anyway, that this would ever be at risk. We always assumed that the system would be, tested, that there would be crises and challenges, but not that the fundamental nature of who America is would be in question. And I think a lot of people are questioning that today from different ideological points of view and from different angles. But it's a different moment, I think, than we've seen.
It's a bit scary, especially because it isn't for the same reasons.
Right.
And that's what makes it even harder.
No consensus what to do about it.
No consensus on what to do. All right, let's pause here.
We should be getting vaccinated. And over the past few months, we were urged to roll up our sleeves again for a booster. But as the highly contagious Omicron strain emerged, concerns arose about the vaccine's durability. With that, officials doubled down on the need to get an additional dose. And now it looks like that advice was sound. 3 Centers for Disease Control and Prevention studies released Friday have found that people who are boosted are more protected against the virus mutation than those who aren't. The first study looked at hospitalizations and emergency room and urgent care center visits in 10 states from August to this month. In that data, researchers observed that vaccine protection dropped from 94% during the Delta wave to 82% during the Omicron wave, especially if the second dose was over 6 months ago. But they also saw that full protection returned after a third dose of the Pfizer or Moderna shots. The second study focused on coronavirus cases and death rates in half of all states, at a time when the Delta strain was dominant and when Omicron was just starting to enter the U.S. It also found people who were boosted had the highest protection against infection. The third study examined people who tested positive for the virus from December 10th to January 1st at more than 4,600 testing sites across the nation. That data confirmed 3 shots of the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines were about 67% effective against Omicron-related symptoms, while 2 doses offered no significant protection against Omicron. Experts at the CDC say the studies underscore just how important getting vaccinated and boosted is, though as it stands, just 39% of the country has gotten a third dose. I'm Tali Anderson reporting.
Thank you, Tali.
Administration, but the U.S. Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services under President Biden announced last month it was denying it. A request for comment on the suit was not immediately returned.
Such a Trump Republican agree on this issue. Take a listen.
I really do like Trump, but I'm more of a fan of the movement he started than the man himself. Again, I would like to see these kind of young, more populist Republicans kind of take a leading role in the party.
I wouldn't be so in favor of a populist regime for a Republican. I think especially with the Glenn Youngkin victory, we can show that like a more traditional Republican that really values the social issues is important and still, upholds the free market principles.
Now, look, these are Georgia Republicans who are still shell-shocked from the role the former president made in basically costing him those Senate seats, and you can hear that tension in there. Do you buy the idea that Trump's grip is loosening?
Well, Chuck, as Trump has become less visible, the Republican Party is actually starting to grow into whatever it's going to be next. And I think you're seeing that in Florida with Ron DeSantis' strong libertarian streak, right? Opposing COVID restrictions, opposing government mandates, being skeptical of big corporations, of big tech, for example. In Miami, a little further down, Republican Mayor Francis Suarez embracing cryptocurrency. So you're starting to see what a younger Republican Party can look like. The question is, when Trump comes back, if he runs again, do we stop talking about all these things, and does it once again become exclusively the party of one man.
But Chuck, Leader McCarthy is very clear. He thinks he needs former President Trump in order to win back control of the House. And look at all of the races that the former president is inserting himself into, not just congressional races, but gubernatorial races as well. And so you have this moderate Republican governors who are really becoming a dying breed. So I think he still very much has a strong grip over the party. It's notable that that voter referenced Glenn Youngkin, because Glenn Youngkin walked a very fine line.
Right.
He did not push Trump away altogether. He just said, I'm going to accept his endorsement. I'm going to espouse some of his ideals. At the same time, I'm never going to appear with him in public. So it's really that tension, I think, that Republicans are dealing with. By the way, White House officials saying we're bracing for a Trump nomination. I mean, that's how
Racing
they're
or
viewing
hoping?
this. Well, good question. Maybe a little of both.
Yeah,
Donald Trump is not good for democracy.
I just said quickly, that's a great point, because even though Trump is less visible, he's
Yeah.
just as influential. Why? Because Republican elected officials fear him, and they have to check with him before they do anything.
Simone, I've had a theory on here. If Donald Trump were on Twitter, Joe Biden's approval ratings would be 5 points higher. Do you think the lack of visibility has made people forget about the threat?
No, because I don't think so. Look, I think the reality is, and you heard, I mean, the Congresswoman talked about this morning, that top of mind for people across the country, she said folks in her district probably aren't watching the show. I think they're watching, Chuck. But I do think they're watching.
Especially the panel.
Exactly, they love the panel. But top of mind is inflation, is in fact the effects of the pandemic, how they're going to put money in their pockets, put food on their table. And that is something that the White House is focused on, but they do have to talk about that in very practical ways. And it's not just, voters in the Congresswoman's district, it's Black voters, it's Latino voters, and that's what they want to hear too.
By the way, we didn't talk about the Kyrsten Sinema.
Though, because in Arizona, if you ask Democrats in Arizona, they will tell you that this goes back to Senator Sinema voting against the minimum wage hike and COVID-19, voting against things that she said she stood for with the party. And so I think that it's a little more complicated. It's not as black and white as
The problem is nationally, it's going to look like, oh, the Democrats are kicking out the middle. Like, I get what you're saying, but it's what this picture looks like.
Well, I think you're right. And I think that's why you're not going to see the White House come out and support what happened. At the same time, privately, if you talk to administration officials, if you talk to Democrats on Capitol Hill, their frustration with Senator Sinema, particularly when it comes to some of those policies you just laid out, Simone, is that they don't know where she stands until the 11th hour.
It's the mercurialness of her.
Correct,
It's
and it
not,
makes it very hard to negotiate with her. And I
Joe
think that's
Manchin
the
always answers the
frustration.
phone, right?
Right.
And he at least tells you something.
And whenever we say, where
That's
is
what I
Senator Sinema on this, they always say, your guess is as good as ours.
Concessions with nothing in return. That's why Putin smells weakness. He's wanted this, as you and I talked about, for a long time.
Yeah.
It's his legacy issue.
Right.
And if we don't provide that deterrence, he will go in.
Well, the Germans have sort of been uncomfortable with the idea of moving on Nord Stream, and the administration is saying they're waiting on that. On the other risk here, we have midterm races coming up. In 2018, the United States took offensive action against Russia to stop them from meddling in those races. Do we need to see something like that in 2022?
I don't want to see Russia overturning Ukraine's government. I don't want to see any foreign nation adversary getting involved in our elections. But again, pointing from Afghanistan forward, we have sent a message to our adversaries that we are projecting weakness, not strength. One thing Reagan taught was peace through strength, going back to Chamberlain, Hitler. If we're projecting weakness, it only invites aggression. Historically, you know that. And this is exactly, I've talked to the administration. I want to stop this from happening, but I'm very concerned about the aggression that I'm seeing.
Okay. Congressman, thank you very much for your perspective. We'll be right back with Dr. Scott.
Are providing. It's providing some benefit. And a lot of schools that couldn't implement social distancing, couldn't implement testing, or relying on masks as their only tool. So to withdraw it right at the peak of the epidemic, I think is imprudent. We should wait. I think within 2 weeks we'll be able to make that decision. But this whole COVID epidemic, I think, has been colored by the fact that policymakers have not prescribed clear endpoints to when they're going to withdraw these measures. I think parents are willing to tolerate masks in schools, recognizing it's very disruptive to children if there is an end date to it, if it's clearly prescribed when we're going to use these masks and when we're going to withdraw them so they don't disrupt 2 years of a child's socialization and school activities. So I think policymakers stepping in and saying, look, we're going to put an end point on this when prevalence declines to a certain level, and in sticking to it is very prudent. But to do it in a setting of the peak of this epidemic, I think puts a difficulty on schools that have based their mitigation around the use of masks.
What's that benchmarked in your mind? Are you all concerned about rising prices and inflation?
I go to the grocery store now. I'm paying double the amount that I was paying, even a few months ago. Everything's gone up. My granddaughter loves bacon, by the way, and I can barely afford bacon.
And whose fault do you think that is? I mean, it's the Federal Reserve that controls interest rates. It's their job to control inflation. Do you blame the president? Do you blame the central bankers? Or do you blame just Congress?
I know the Federal Reserve is talking about increasing the interest rate, but I think it's a combination. Congress is worthless. You don't even want me to start on Congress.
I actually do, because this is one of the things. In President Biden's first year, one of the things they say they are most proud of is this historic investment in infrastructure and the fact they got Republicans and Democrats to sign on to it. Even with that, you still say they're worthless.
I do, because there's so much more that needs to be done.
Like what? What do you need?
I need for the price of bacon to go down.
Are near all-time records, though the number has shown signs of stabilizing. The quick spread of the strain forcing many Americans to hit the pause button on a full return to normal.
Worrying about every single thing you touch, every certain person you speak to, the people you get together with. So, it's tiring, so it takes a toll.
But even with Omicron appearing to slow down, health experts are warning it won't be the last mutation of the virus.
It tells us a lot about what we might expect from a next variant, that it really could come out of nowhere, that it could really change its properties, evade our immunity. And the thing that I think worries people the most is it can become a lot more contagious, and there's nothing to say it can't also become deadlier.
The White House is now banking on increased testing as the best way to get out in front of another potential wave. They've pledged to send out 1 billion free tests to American households. Those free at-home tests started shipping this week. You can order them online at covidtest.gov. In Atlanta, Charles Watson, Fox.
I would not support sending American troops into Ukraine in response to a Russian invasion because, frankly, I think we would simply be sacrificing them, and I think the Russians would escalate dramatically. I do think that we should provide as much support as we possibly can from our NATO allies that are immediately adjacent to Ukraine. And I'm looking at a bipartisan bill that would provide material support to Ukraine, something that the administration is actively moving forward on.
Should President Biden hold a third summit with Putin? If so, how soon, and what should he say? What would you recommend?
Well, Biden communicated in person with Putin early in his presidency on his first trip to Europe to lay out some clear expectations about what we would do, what NATO would do, what the United States and our partners would be committed to doing. I do think a similar conversation, to the extent it could lead to a diplomatic off-ramp for this confrontation, would be constructive. Frankly, what I think we can do here in the Senate is provide bipartisan support for as forceful a response and sustained support to Ukraine as we possibly can.
Which we refer to as the SCIF, and spoke to the president, who was at the Situation Room with Mr. Ricchetti, who's one of his chief counsels, and Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor. And we certainly had some observations, but I can tell you, in terms of resolve and willingness to say we are going to respond if this occurs, the delegation of 4 Democrats and 3 Republicans was unanimous. There's very little distance between us. I hope we can craft some legislation. I've been talking to the White House about that. I know Senator Portman and Senator Shaheen are perhaps the lead negotiators there, working with Bob Menendez, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee.
Now, before that, you went on this bipartisan trip, this fastest whirlwind trip, Democrats, Republicans, to Ukraine. You spoke to President Zelensky in Ukraine. What did he tell you that stuck in your mind?
You know, it's remarkable. They have been facing this Russian threat for a long time, and there's not a sense of panic. There's a sense of resolve on their part, but Ukrainians are not running around with their hair on fire about the Russian buildup. If it happens, if they cross into the sovereign territory of Ukraine, there'll be a huge response, and I know the leadership up to, including President Zelensky, the foreign minister and the defense minister, they all know there'll be casualties, but there will be fighting, and they'll be fighting not only by the Ukrainian troops, but also just sort of like former military members. You know, 20% of the population of Ukraine has served in uniform. And if the Russians think they can easily take major cities and go into the heartland of Ukraine, they're going to have to do it house to house and block to block. And that's a calculation that Mr. Putin needs to take into consideration. Friends in NATO to do the same.
At what point,
in and out of NATO.
At what point does he care about crippling sanctions? I mean, we sanction many countries, hoping that a lot of behavior will be changed. But at what point does it actually impinge on Putin to change?
We should sanction the individuals, family members of Vladimir Putin, who put their money in dollars and who depend on the security of our banking system. They should be sanctioned.
How about Putin himself?
We've never found a sanction that really hurt him, but I can guarantee you, if our administration has the resolve, we can make this very, very painful. And frankly, one of the reasons Putin does these things is his economy is so bad. His stewardship of the actual lives and success of the Russian people has been very, very poor. They do not live well. And so occasionally he waves the bloody shirt and points to somebody else in a Hitler-esque way and blames peace-loving nations for some sort of pretext of a provocation. That's the way he stays in power.
Would you